Hey everyone, welcome back to an Illustrator tutorial. Now today I'm going to go in depth with lines and strokes. Now this video is going to be a long one, so without further ado, let's get right into the tutorial. Now I'm going to go back to the basics. So when you start out your Illustrator file, I technically do 2500 times 2500 pixels. I do that number because it's a large enough scale. Whatever you render in that size, it'll be high quality enough for whatever you're drawing. And I choose a square because, I like to keep it consistent, all the time. And you can name the Illustrator file whatever you like. I'm just going to name the strokes and yeah. So before we even dive into the card drawing, I want to explain all the basic fundamentals I use when I draw strokes. So when you start out, you'll notice you will have a fill color, which is usually white, and a stroke color, which is usually black. So what you want to do is click this button down here and just get rid of the fill. Now the color of the stroke can be personal preference, but most of the time I just keep it black. And also I want to note that I keep the color mode in RGB. So I go up here and I go to RGB color and I just change it. And actually it automatically gives me this nice black. It's not fully black, it's kind of like a grayish black, but it's very nice. So right before you start drawing, you just want to make sure that you have a layer dedicated to strokes. Now when you're starting out doing lines in Illustrator, I mostly use the pen tool for everything. So in order to draw a basic line, you just click one point to another. And if the path isn't ending, you can hold Alt and click somewhere else to end the path. It just makes your workflow a lot quicker. Another shortcut I use is I select it with the select tool, the line, and I hold Alt or Control, or if you're on Windows, I'm not quite sure, but on Mac it's Alt. And I hold that and I drag it, and that's just a quick copy and paste. Or if you're old school, you can do Control C, Control V. And in that way, you don't have to keep redrawing the same line. Now, if you want to move direct points or specific parts of the line, I would recommend using the direct select tool, and you just select wherever you want, mostly the anchor points, and you drag it, and you can do this to combine lines. Also, you might find out that if you want to directly overlay lines or get them exact, you might not be able to do this. So what I do most of the time is I press Command Y, and it makes me see directly where I'm putting the line, and it's not dependent on the stroke width. It shows the thinnest line possible, so you can see exactly where you're putting your anchor points and your strokes. Also, if you want to fully join the stroke after you do this step, you just highlight the two anchor points with the direct select tool, obviously, and you press Command J. That means just Command Join, and that's how you join it. Another tool I use, I'm not quite sure what it's called, but it just curves the edges. Right before I get to that step though, I'm going to draw a cube. And if you want to have straight lines when you draw strokes, just hold Shift and it'll be at a 45-degree angle or 90-degree angles or a 180. Basically, the rules are 360. So this is the round corners. So any corners you have that are joined, including the ones we did before, if you highlight it with the direct select tool and you see this little circle, it'll just curve it. And this is very helpful when, say, you don't want to curve lines manually. You can draw them, rigidly and then curve them later. Also, an interesting tip is using the shaper tool. So if I draw two lines here and say I don't want the middle of this cube here, I just draw two, I highlight it all, and then I choose the shaper tool, and then I hold Alt and click the lines I want to delete. And then we end up with two rectangles. But this is very helpful when you have lines that are overlaying, and this comes very helpful in, random situations. You might notice that you're not able to curve some of the corners after you use the shaper tool. So all you have to do is press Command J to join the corners. Now, say you have reflections or shapes that are really, really similar, but the opposite. All you can do is just copy and paste it and go up to Object, Transform, and Reflect. You can choose vertical or horizontal. It depends on how much you want to reflect it. And you can choose the angle too. Now, if you're not confident in drawing lines that are curvy, I would recommend the Curve Pen tool, and this is very helpful. It's pretty much the same as the pen tool, but wherever you draw, it just curves the lines for you automatically. Now, if you're drawing something that is curvy but also straight, that's totally fine. All you have to do is just press Alt on the previous anchor point and it'll go straight for that period of time. Or you can do a combination of the curve pen tool and the normal pen tool. Say you draw half of the circle with the curve pen tool, and then you go back to the pen tool and then draw the rest in a rectangular shape. All these steps come hand in hand because even after that, you can actually just curve the corners too. And then you can use the shaper tool, etc., etc. These steps are just here to help you get the drawing or desired outline that you need. Now, if you find out that the curved line that you drew isn't what you wanted, that's totally okay. You can go back and edit it with the smooth tool. Now, it's kind of hidden. It's where the shaper tool is, but you hold Alt and click, click, click until you find it. And what you do is you just draw over the curved line that you drew previously, roughly, and it'll fix it up and remove some anchor points. And, you know, if you've drawn it with too many anchor points, it'll get rid of them and smooth it out more. When you're drawing, there'll be shapes that you technically don't have to draw yourself. They can just be warped circles or squares, and just use that to your advantage. I always recommend starting out with the weight of your stroke at 1 pixel. That's because if you're drawing it at a very thick one, you might not know what's going on. But it's up to you, but I highly recommend 1 pixel. Now, the way you increase it is you just go up to the stroke menu on the right, and you just press the arrow button and increase it. There's also a lot of options. You can change the cap of the stroke. That's the roundness at the end of the stroke. You can change the corner if it's rounded or not rounded. And you can choose if the stroke is inside or outside the anchor or in the middle. This is very helpful, and it's really up to you. There's also a dash line setting. This is very helpful, for example, when you're drawing shoes, but for the car we're drawing today, maybe not. Another tip that I discovered on my own was turning strokes into fills and then turning it back to strokes. Let me demonstrate. If you make a stroke and then you increase the weight and then go to Object Expand and make sure the fill and stroke tick is on and you press OK, it turns that stroke into a fill, pretty much a rectangle. But then what you can do then is turn on the stroke again and it will have a stroke outline. This is very helpful for drawing very small rectangles and other shapes that would otherwise be, you know, kind of impossible to do. Adjusting weights of the stroke too is very easy. All you have to do is select the width tool, and then you can choose the anchors and you can play around and increase it or decrease it. You can add your anchors too anywhere on the line, but I would recommend doing it where you added the anchors in the first place because it just looks more natural. And this is pretty much all the fundamental tips I use when I draw strokes. So now I'm just going to go on to explaining the actual process of me drawing the car because I use a lot of these tips and I use them almost every time I start drawing something with strokes. Now, the first step and the first goal that you should be worried about or concerned is just getting down the basic 1-point-pixel strokes and the basic stroke fills. Now, from the tools I explained earlier, I'm going to go in depth and explain specific parts of the car and how I did it. The tires, in most cases, is no-brainer because it's just a circle and it's just using the shaper tool and a bunch of other things. So all I did was I drew a basic circle, I drew a basic rectangle, and I overlaid them, and I highlighted both of them, and I used the shaper tool to delete some lines. Then what I did was I joined the corners, and then I curved them. And that's pretty much how I got that shape. Now, the parts that surround the tire on the body of the car is kind of similar, actually. All I did was draw a circle, and then I had 2 lines, and I used the shaper tool again, and then I joined the corners. Now, obviously, I like rounding. It's one of my favorite things. If there's sharp corners in anything, I'm like, ugh. But that's what I did, and that's how I achieved that for the car. Now, when you're joining lines, you might come across a problem. When you join it, you're not able to curve it, and that's just a glitch in the system. All you have to do is double-click the line, use the scissor tool, and then cut a certain section of the line off. Use the direct select tool, drag the line back to the other anchor point of the stroke, highlight them both, rejoin it, and then you should be able to curve it then. Little shapes like this on the car are also very simple. Since the design is very straight, you mostly just hold shift for most of the lines. And then at the end, you just curve it, and then you change it from a stroke to a fill, and that's how I do it. Same for these aspects outside of the car. However, sometimes when the curvy lines may seem too difficult to do, you can just draw the basic geometric straight lines and then curve the corners later, like this. A common issue with drawing the tires, or more so the inside of the tire, you have to use math if you want to get it perfect. So the rule of thumb is if there's anything surrounding the inner of the tire, which is like the bolts or anything like that, all you have to do is get a 360 degrees because that's the angle of a circle, and divide it by how many bolts or whatever there is. So for example, in this case, there's 4 bolts. All you have to do is go 360 divided by 4. And whatever value you get then, that's how much it should surround the circle. That's the angle, if that makes sense. Get the rotate tool, hold Alt and drag it to the center, and then input the value that you got from calculating it from 360 divided by whatever number. And then you use a bunch of the tips I used earlier to get the desired result because the inner of the tires are always different for each car. I also use the shaper tool to delete certain parts. Obviously, for example, the shadow under the car. This is pretty much just a very long circle. In some cases, the shaper tool is not the best thing to do. So I would just recommend maybe just selecting the object itself and using the eraser tool, but it's really up to you. The shaper tool is a lot faster, but the eraser tool, you know, it's also works in its own weird kind of way. So it's really up to you and how you want to delete things. The top of the car, I just use the curve pen tool, and everything else is pretty much self-explanatory. If you use the tools that I explained earlier to draw your strokes, you should be able to draw a car like this pretty much. An important note I should have mentioned earlier, but when you're drawing the strokes and the stroke fills, have them on separate layers. This is because when you get to the point when you want to increase the stroke, you won't be able to select all of them by just highlighting, because if you do that and they're on the same layer, you'll select the strokes and the non-stroke layers, and it all just gets messy. So a rule of thumb is to make sure that when you're drawing something different, categorically, if that's a word, just make sure that it's on a different layer so that when you want to edit in the future, it's not a hassle. This comes into play when you're increasing the strokes. So all you have to do is just highlight everything. And I recommend, for this drawing, it was around 7, 8 to 9 pixels. And it might look weird at the stage, or it might look okay. But after you maximize everything, what I usually do is I do specific line categories that I want to reduce. So for example, the door, the tires, headlights, and mostly anything inside of the car, you want to reduce the stroke to about 3 to 2 pixels. I also want to note that I did draw random lines that I knew beforehand that I was going to change the weight and thickness. For example, these accents in the middle of the car. So keep that in mind too when you're drawing. Now, just for time's sake, I'm probably not going to go over each line and, talk about, how I adjusted the stroke and the thickness, because it's pretty much the same for every line. But however, I want you to keep this rule in mind. Everything outside or everything on the outer of the drawing probably needs to be thicker, and as you go more inside to the middle of the drawing, and it needs to be thinner. Now, you don't have to follow this, but this is what I like to do. And this really works well with car drawings, especially. If you want to know specifically the things that I increase to the maximum thickness, especially the roof of the car, the windows, the front, the back, the bottom of the car, and the tires. Those are usually the thickest. And the thinnest things are usually the doors, the lights, the number plates, anything inside, the windscreen. The inside of windscreens. Now, this is a trial and error process you have to gauge, and it's going to be different for each car or whatever you're drawing. A few extra things that I like to add after I finish doing the thickness of the strokes, but at this point, you're pretty much done. So, pat yourself on the back. Now, if you've discovered that there's some rounded corners that, weren't round enough and, you didn't want to go back into the line and, change everything, that's totally okay. What I like to do is to go on the fill stroke layer, which is just the black lines, and I just like to draw my own curves with the curve pen tool. And this is a tedious process, but at the end of the day, it just makes it look a lot better and smoother. I also want to note that when you're adjusting the outer strokes, when they're thicker and the inside ones are thinner, you also might have to use the scissor tool just to cut the lines in case you drew things that were connected along the way. And in that case, sometimes the lines are going to look weird. So what you want to do is just use the direct select tool and join it up, or use the fill stroke layer and just make it look neater and tidy it up. But I think that's everything. If I missed something or you wanted to know how to do something else in the drawing, please let me know in the comments. But I hope you enjoyed watching this video, and I hope you learned everything you can about strokes and to draw cars. Now, I have a tradition in my videos where I show you the final product, but this time around there's no really final product because I was just explaining how to draw the strokes this time around. But anyway, I hope you learned something, and I hope to see car drawings from you guys somehow. But I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.